The executives in the control room weren't watching the game. They were watching the numbers. And what they saw in the first 15 minutes made 3 of them reach for their phones simultaneously. Not to report bad news. Not to activate the carefully prepared contingency plans that every network keeps locked in a drawer for exactly this kind of risk. They were calling people who needed to see what was happening. Because the ratings ticker climbing on their screens wasn't just exceeding projections. It was rewriting them. $76 billion had been riding on this moment. An entire network sports identity had been staked on a decision that half the industry called reckless, that critics called manufactured, that traditionalists called an insult to the game's history. And now, less than 20 minutes into the broadcast, every single one of those doubters was being proven wrong in real time. This is the story of how Caitlin Clark turned NBC's most dangerous bet into a cultural inflection point. But it's also the story of what happens when a league that spent decades fighting for visibility suddenly finds itself holding all the cards. And it's the story of a broadcasting decision that most people still don't understand. By the end of this, you'll understand why NBC executives called this their moonshot moment in private meetings months before the broadcast aired. You'll understand the specific numbers the league quietly celebrated but refused to make the official headline. And you'll understand the one detail about how Caitlin Clark was selected for this role that changes everything you thought you knew about why she was there. This isn't just a ratings story. This is the story of how women's basketball stopped asking for a seat at the table and started building its own. To understand what happened on February 1, 2025, you have to understand what didn't happen for 23 years before it. The NBA on NBC was once the defining sports broadcast in American television. The iconic theme song. The voices of Marv Albert and Bob Costas. The images of Jordan's final shot, Kobe and Shaq lifting trophies, a league at the absolute peak of its cultural dominance. Then in 2002, it all went dark. NBC lost the rights. ESPN and TNT carved up the landscape. An entire generation of basketball fans grew up without ever once seeing the NBA on a Peacock network. The players who defined that era became coaches, analysts, and Hall of Famers doing guest spots on the very broadcast that had replaced their home. When NBC came back, they didn't return with a soft relaunch. They returned with an 11-year, $76 billion media rights agreement. The single largest in NBA history. That number deserves to sit with you for a moment. $76 billion. That's not a network testing the waters. That's an institutional declaration. And when you're spending that kind of money, the launch broadcast isn't just television. It's a statement of intent to the entire sports media industry. Every choice matters. Every face matters. Every second of that first night will be studied, analyzed, and remembered. And NBC put Caitlin Clark at the main desk. Not as a sideline correspondent. Not as a guest analyst for a single segment. At the main desk. Primetime. Madison Square Garden. Next to Hall of Famers and analysts who had spent decades earning their chairs. A 22-year-old who had never called a professional basketball game in her life. Who had just finished her rookie WNBA season. Who half the sports media world still couldn't decide if they loved or resented. The second that decision leaked, the industry erupted. The criticism was immediate and predictable. Too young. Too inexperienced. Hasn't earned the seat. Only there because of hype, not substance. You heard versions of this argument across every sports media platform that had an opinion to offer. Former players questioned the choice. Analysts with decades of broadcast experience wondered openly if NBC was sacrificing credibility for clicks. The narrative hardened quickly. This was a stunt, a marketing ploy, a network gambling on celebrity over competence because they didn't trust their product to stand on its own. What almost none of them understood was that NBC had been building toward this specific moment for years. And the decision to put Clark in that chair had nothing to do with desperation. It had everything to do with data, strategy, and a bet on where American sports audiences were actually going. This is where the story most people know diverges from the story that actually happened. In public, NBC's decision looked reactive. Clark had just finished a rookie season that shattered WNBA attendance records. Her games averaged over 1.18 million viewers, more than double the league's previous averages. She had become the most marketable athlete in women's sports history within 12 months of entering the league. The assumption was simple. NBC saw a hot name and grabbed her while she was trending. But inside NBC Sports headquarters, the strategy was far older. Long before Caitlin Clark played her first WNBA game, before she led Iowa to back-to-back national championship appearances, NBC's sports division had been quietly restructuring its entire basketball approach. The network had been studying the demographics of basketball viewership for years, and what they found was a shift that most legacy broadcasters were either ignoring or actively resisting. The traditional NBA audience was aging. Hardcore basketball purists, the viewers who would watch any game simply because it was basketball, were being replaced by a younger, more selective audience that chose broadcasts based on storytelling, personality, and cultural relevance as much as the sport itself. And that audience was watching women's basketball at rates that didn't match any historical precedent. NBC's internal data showed something the industry wasn't talking about publicly. During the 2024 NCAA tournament, when Clark led Iowa to the championship game, viewership demographics revealed a massive influx of first-time basketball viewers. People who had never watched a basketball game before were tuning in specifically because of one player. And these weren't casual drive-by viewers. They were engaged. They stayed. They came back for the next game. And they were disproportionately younger, more female, and more valuable to advertisers than the traditional sports audience networks had been fighting over for decades. When NBC secured the NBA rights, they weren't just buying games. They were buying a platform. And the executives who structured that deal had already identified their long-term play: make NBC the network that didn't just broadcast basketball, but redefined how basketball was consumed. Clark wasn't a reaction to her rookie success. She was the strategy. But there was a problem. Actually, there were several problems, and every single one of them could have derailed the entire plan. First, Clark had zero broadcast experience. This wasn't a minor gap in her resume. This was a fundamental question about whether she could do the job at all. Plenty of legendary athletes have failed spectacularly in the broadcasting booth. The skills that make someone elite on the court don't automatically translate to the desk. Speaking naturally to a camera, analyzing plays in real time, finding chemistry with co-hosts, filling dead air without rambling, these are technical skills that take years to develop. And NBC was throwing Clark into the most watched basketball broadcast in over 2 decades with essentially no runway. Second, the optics were dangerous. Put a rookie WNBA player, not even a retired legend but an active rookie, at the main desk of your flagship NBA broadcast, and you're inviting every possible criticism. You're telling Hall of Famers that their experience matters less than someone's social media following. You're telling your existing broadcast team that they're not enough to carry the return. You're telling sports purists that you care more about attention than authenticity. Every one of these criticisms would be amplified by an industry that was already skeptical of NBC's return. Third, and this is the one almost nobody discussed publicly, there was the internal tension between NBC's NBA coverage and its WNBA coverage. The two leagues are connected but distinct. NBC held rights to both. And putting Clark in the NBA broadcast chair raised immediate questions about hierarchy, visibility, and where the network saw the real value. Some inside the organization worried it would look like NBC was using women's basketball as a promotional vehicle for its NBA investment rather than treating the WNBA as valuable on its own terms. These weren't hypothetical concerns. They were active debates happening in meetings, on calls, and in the emails that circulated through NBC Sports in the months before the broadcast. The decision to move forward wasn't unanimous. It wasn't easy. It was a calculated risk that required buy-in from people who genuinely believed it could backfire. And then something shifted. In August 2024, NBC ran a test. It wasn't promoted heavily. It wasn't positioned as a major moment. They brought Clark in for a studio segment during a preseason broadcast, surrounded by experienced analysts, given a limited role, just to see how she handled the environment. What happened in that studio changed the entire internal conversation. Clark didn't just perform adequately. She performed like someone who had been doing this for years. She spoke naturally. She offered analysis that showed genuine basketball intelligence, not just rehearsed talking points. She found chemistry with the existing hosts almost immediately. And most importantly, she did something that veteran broadcasters often struggle to do. She made complicated basketball concepts accessible without dumbing them down. The producers watching from the control room that night started making calls before the segment even ended. The feedback loops that usually took days compressed into hours. By the following week, the internal skeptics had largely gone quiet. Not because they'd been overruled, but because the evidence was overwhelming. Clark was a natural. The question wasn't whether she could do the job. The question became how big a role she could handle. The decision to put her at the main desk for the February 1st return broadcast was made in October 2024. 4 months before the public knew anything was happening. 4 months of preparation, coaching, and strategic positioning. 4 months of keeping a decision secret that would have dominated sports media coverage if it leaked. It did leak, eventually. 3 weeks before the broadcast, word got out. And the reaction confirmed everything NBC both hoped and feared. The critics materialized instantly. Skip Bayless questioned the move on air. Former players expressed skepticism in interviews. Sports media Twitter erupted with takes that ranged from cautious doubt to outright dismissal. The phrase, diversity hire, appeared more than once, a coded accusation that Clark's presence was performative rather than substantive. Some analysts went further, suggesting NBC was disrespecting the athletes who had earned their seats through years of broadcast work. But something else happened too. Something the critics didn't anticipate. The announcement drove engagement unlike anything NBC's sports division had seen in years. Social media mentions of the broadcast spiked. Advanced interest in the February 1st game shattered projections. And the demographics of that interest matched exactly what NBC's internal data had predicted. Younger viewers. More female viewers. First-time basketball viewers who had followed Clark from Iowa to the WNBA and were now prepared to follow her to an NBA broadcast desk. The controversy wasn't hurting NBC. It was building their audience. This is where the story shifts from strategy to execution. Because all the data, all the positioning, all the internal buy-in means nothing if the broadcast itself fails. And on the night of February 1st, 2025, every assumption was about to be tested in real time. Madison Square Garden. Knicks versus Bulls. A building with more basketball history embedded in its walls than most franchises have in their entire existence. The kind of venue where legends either confirm their status or reveal their limitations. And Caitlin Clark was about to step onto that stage. The broadcast began at 8 p.m. Eastern. By 8:03, the viewership numbers were already exceeding projections. By 8:10, they had passed the upper threshold of what NBC's optimistic models had anticipated. By 8:15, the executives in the control room were watching something that sports television rarely produces, a genuine real-time phenomenon. 4.5 million viewers tuned in. That number demands context. When NBC last aired the NBA in 2002, league viewership was an entirely different landscape. Streaming didn't exist. Social media didn't exist. The fragmentation that has decimated traditional television ratings across every category hadn't yet begun. In 2025, pulling 4.5 million viewers for a regular season NBA game wasn't just impressive. It was exceptional. It was a number that primetime NFL games struggled to reach consistently. It was a number that made every sports network executive in the country pay attention. But the raw viewership wasn't even the most important metric. The demographics told a more significant story. The audience was younger than typical NBA broadcasts. It was more female than typical NBA broadcasts. And according to NBC's internal tracking, a meaningful percentage of those viewers had never watched an NBA game on NBC before. They weren't legacy fans returning for a nostalgia trip. They were new viewers, drawn to the broadcast by something that had nothing to do with traditional NBA appeal. They were drawn by Caitlin Clark. Now here's where the narrative gets complicated, because success always invites scrutiny, and the scrutiny that followed February 1st revealed tensions that most casual fans still don't fully understand. Clark's presence on the broadcast was celebrated by NBC and seized upon by the network's marketing operation as proof that their strategy was working. But within certain corners of the basketball media world, the celebration came with an asterisk. Some analysts pointed out that the Knicks-Bulls matchup was already one of the more anticipated games of the season, regardless of who was calling it. The Madison Square Garden setting added inherent drama. The historic return of the NBA to NBC would have drawn curiosity viewers regardless. To credit Clark entirely for the ratings, they argued, was to overstate her individual impact. This criticism wasn't entirely wrong. Isolating any single variable in a complex broadcast environment is methodologically challenging. But it also missed the larger point, which NBC's internal data made abundantly clear. The pre-broadcast engagement, the advanced social media conversation, the demographic skew of the audience. All of these metrics traced directly back to Clark's involvement. The game and the venue were factors, but they were not the factor. Clark was. And then there's what happened during the broadcast itself. The moments that went viral weren't the game highlights. They weren't Carmelo Anthony's analysis or the veteran host's commentary. The moments that dominated social media on the night of February 1st were Caitlin Clark moments. Her reaction shots. Her analysis of a pick and roll that demonstrated genuine basketball fluency. A brief exchange with her co-host that showed chemistry and quick wit. An off-script comment about a player's defensive tendencies that impressed even the most skeptical analysts watching. Within hours, the clips had accumulated millions of views. By the following morning, the broadcast was the most discussed sports television event of the weekend. By Monday, NBC's phones were ringing with advertisers who had previously expressed only tepid interest in the network's basketball coverage. The $76 billion bet was starting to look like the smartest investment in sports media history. But here's the thing about success of this magnitude. It doesn't just benefit the people in the room. It sends shockwaves through the entire industry. The WNBA watched everything that happened on February 1st with a complicated mixture of pride and strategic calculation. The league had spent years fighting for visibility. It had weathered decades of dismissive coverage, insultingly low salaries, arena matchups against major NBA games, media deals that paid pennies on the dollar compared to the men's league. And now, one of its players, a rookie and active roster member, someone who was simultaneously building a WNBA legacy, had just become the most talked about figure in the biggest basketball broadcast in over 2 decades. The league's internal conversations in the weeks following the broadcast centered on a question that had never been relevant before. How do we leverage this? How do we ensure that Caitlin Clark's individual success translates into structural gains for the entire league? The answer was already unfolding. NBC's success with Clark didn't exist in isolation. It existed within the context of a WNBA media rights negotiation that was happening simultaneously. The league's previous media deal, signed years earlier, was widely considered one of the worst contracts in professional sports. It had locked the WNBA into an arrangement that undervalued its content, limited its exposure, and ensured that the league's growth was constrained by broadcast agreements that treated women's basketball as an afterthought. But the negotiating landscape was different now. The league had proof. Not projections, not theories, not hopeful arguments about potential audiences. It had Caitlin Clark and the 4.5 million viewers who had tuned in specifically because of her. It had demographic data that showed exactly who those viewers were and why they mattered to advertisers. It had February 1st as a case study in what women's basketball could generate when given proper platform and promotion. The new WNBA media rights deal that was eventually announced represented a tenfold increase over the previous agreement. Where the league had once received less than $60 million annually, the new deal was valued at over $200 million per year. 11 years. Nearly $2.5 billion total. In the context of media rights deals, this was still smaller than the major men's leagues. But the percentage increase was staggering. And the message was clear. The market had finally recognized what the league had been arguing for decades. Women's basketball wasn't a niche product. It was an undervalued asset. Now let's trace the direct line from February 1st to this outcome. When NBC executives sat down with WNBA representatives during rights negotiations, they came with data that fundamentally changed the conversation. They could demonstrate empirically that Caitlin Clark drove measurable viewership. They could show that the audience she attracted was demographically valuable, younger, more diverse, more engaged on social media. They could prove that investing in women's basketball wasn't a charity case or a diversity initiative. It was a business opportunity that their competitors had undervalued for years. And they weren't the only network at the table. ESPN and Amazon were also negotiating for WNBA rights. And suddenly, the dynamic that had defined previous negotiations, where the WNBA was forced to accept whatever scraps the networks offered, had reversed completely. There was genuine competition. There were multiple networks arguing for packages. There were bidding wars over specific windows and exclusive content rights. For the first time in the league's history, the WNBA was able to negotiate from a position of strength rather than desperation. And Caitlin Clark's February 1st broadcast was the inflection point that made it possible. Let me be precise about what this means because the scale can obscure the human reality underneath. A tenfold increase in media rights revenue doesn't just mean better TV deals. It means higher salaries for players. It means improved facilities, better travel arrangements, more resources for player development. It means the end of an era where WNBA players were forced to play overseas during the off-season because their domestic salaries couldn't sustain their careers. It means retirement security, reduced physical toll, longer careers, better quality of life for every player in the league, not just the stars. When you understand this, the stakes of February 1st become something other than television ratings. They become a question of economic justice, of labor value, of who gets paid fairly for their work and who doesn't. And the fact that a single broadcast could contribute to shifting that balance tells you something about how broken the previous system was. If one good night of ratings can justify a tenfold increase in compensation, then the decades of undervaluation weren't just unfair. They were indefensible. But there's another layer to this story that most coverage has ignored entirely. Caitlin Clark didn't have to do the NBC broadcast. She was approached, she was offered the opportunity, and she chose to accept it. But the decision wasn't as simple as it might appear. There were real risks, and she knew what they were. If the broadcast had flopped, if she had struggled on air, if the ratings had been disappointing, she wouldn't have just failed personally. She would have become a data point against women athletes in broadcasting. She would have been cited in every future meeting where someone argued against putting a female athlete at the main desk. The failure would have attached to her gender, her sport, her entire demographic category in ways that male broadcasters rarely experience. She knew this, and she did it anyway. More than that, she did it while still an active player in the middle of her professional career. She did it knowing that every minute of broadcast preparation was a minute not spent on her own game. She did it knowing that success would raise expectations, attract scrutiny, and make her already demanding schedule even more complex. The decision required not just confidence but a specific kind of courage, the willingness to accept risk not just for yourself but for everyone who would come after you. This is where the story starts to feel less like sports media analysis and more like something larger. Because the question that February 1st ultimately answered wasn't whether Caitlin Clark could call an NBA game. It was whether the sports industry would recognize women's basketball as a genuine product with genuine audiences and genuine commercial value. For decades, the answer was no. The league was treated as a loss leader, a goodwill gesture, a thing that major networks supported out of obligation rather than opportunity. The evidence was always there that the audience existed. But the industry chose not to see it, or chose to explain it away, or chose to wait for some future moment when women's basketball would prove itself before investing seriously. February 1st ended that waiting period. The numbers were undeniable. The demographics were undeniable. The advertiser interest, the social media engagement, the cultural conversation, all of it pointed to a single conclusion. The audience was real. The value was real. And any network that continued to undervalue women's basketball content was leaving money on the table while their competitors picked it up. This brings us to the final question, the one that most coverage has avoided because it doesn't fit neatly into a ratings celebration. What happens next? NBC's gamble worked. The numbers proved the strategy. The WNBA's media deal reflected the new reality. Caitlin Clark's broadcast career now runs parallel to her playing career, which means she'll be in front of cameras for decades to come. All of this is measurable, documentable, factually true. But the deeper question is whether February 1st was an inflection point or a peak. Whether the audience that showed up for that broadcast represents a sustainable viewership base or a novelty spike. Whether the infrastructure exists to convert casual interest into long-term fandom. Whether the investment that's now flowing into women's basketball will be sustained when the next negotiation cycle arrives. The optimistic answer is that February 1st opened a door that can't be closed. That the audience has been proven to exist. That the commercial logic is now too compelling to ignore. That Caitlin Clark and the players who follow her will continue to build on this foundation until women's basketball achieves true parity in visibility, compensation, and cultural status. The cautious answer is that sports media is fickle. That audiences move. That the factors that made February 1st work, Clark's specific appeal, the historic NBC return, the perfect venue, may not replicate consistently. That the industry has a long history of discovering women's sports only to forget them again when the next shiny object appears. The honest answer is that nobody knows which version is true. Both possibilities remain open. The outcome depends on decisions that haven't been made yet, performances that haven't happened yet, negotiations that won't occur for years. What we know for certain is this: a door opened. A door that had been locked for decades. A door that countless athletes and advocates and fans had pushed against without success. And on February 1st, 2025, it finally moved. NBC bet $76 billion on basketball. They bet their flagship broadcast return on a 22-year-old woman who had never called a professional game. They bet their network sports identity on a strategy that most of the industry considered reckless. And they won. Not because they were lucky. Not because the moment happened to align in their favor. But because they saw something that others refused to see. They recognized an audience that others had dismissed. They valued a player that others had reduced to controversy and hype. The story was never really about ratings. It was about recognition. It was about an industry finally acknowledging what had been true all along but repeatedly denied. Women's basketball isn't a consolation prize. It isn't a secondary product. It isn't something that audiences tolerate when there's nothing else on. It's what 4.5 million people chose to watch on a Saturday night when they had every other option in the world. And that's the thing about proof. Once you have it, you can't unsee it. Once the numbers are on the board, the old arguments collapse. The excuses evaporate. The explanations that justified decades of underinvestment suddenly sound like what they always were: convenient fictions that protected an unequal status quo. February 1st ended those fictions. What gets built in their place is still being written. But if there's one thing Caitlin Clark proved in that hallway before the broadcast, playing a game of horse she refused to lose, it's that she's not someone who accepts limitations. She's not someone who waits for permission. And she's not someone who's going to let this moment be the ceiling. The NBA is back on NBC. The WNBA just signed its biggest media deal in history. And the woman who made both of those things matter more than they would have otherwise is just getting started. If you want to understand how the business of women's basketball is about to change even more dramatically, the Aya Wilson contract situation might be the most important story nobody's telling yet. Because what happens next in Vegas could make February 1st look like a preview.